Testing. Testing. Handheld mic testing. And this one, test. Yeah. What? I want to. Oh, right there. Only.
Okay. Okay, shall we start? Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, whether in person or online on YouTube. We're really happy to have Margaret Hillenbrand here with us today. I'll just give a quick introduction of our speaker, Margaret. Margaret Hillenbrand is Professor of Modern Chinese Literature and Visual Culture at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on literary and visual studies in contemporary China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, especially cultures of secrecy and protest. Her most recent books include Negative Exposures, Knowing What Not to Know in Contemporary China, published by Duke University Press in 2020, and most recently, a book titled On the Edge, Feeling Precarious in China, published by Columbia University in 2023. Margaret is now working on a book about the cultural politics of the face in Chinese visual culture during the era of biometric surveillance, cosmetic surgery, and mass protest. And I think her talk today will touch more on her latest project, which is what I mentioned just now about the cultural politics of the face in contemporary Chinese society. So without further ado, may I invite Margaret over to give the speech on Read Your Mind facial recognition technology and contemporary Chinese portraiture.
Thank you very much, Minhui, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be in Singapore. The talk I'm going to give today comes from, as Minhui said, my new project, which looks at the cultural politics of the face in 21st century China. And as everyone here knows, face or mianzi has a very long history in anthropology and in sociology as a code word for status, for respectability, for pride, for reputation. But in my project, I try to move away from that idea of mianzi to explore the face as something which is more fleshly, something more concrete. In particular, I'm interested in the face as a channel through which biopower flows in China today. And I look at three facescapes which have shaped governance in China since 2000: the biometric face, the aesthetically modified face, or the cosmetically surgicalized face, and the masked face. And what I'm trying to argue is that the face is a place where power happens, and that spaces of visual culture are reflecting and making real that process. I think it's really interesting that the face has been so overlooked in social theory outside the ideas about face as status that I just mentioned. There's some work by Levinas, there's work by Deleuze and Guattari, and a few more recent geographers and anthropologists. But for the most part, the face is eclipsed by the body right across the humanities. The body is really powerful. It's a kind of ruling doctrine nowadays. Gender, race, disability studies, sexuality, digitality, they all have to think about the body if they want to stay relevant. Meanwhile, the face is still kind of untouched terrain. And if this is true of the humanities generally, I think it's also particularly true of China, where you get this focus on face as respect and status, focusing or combining with a very long visual obsession with one particular face, the face of Mao Zedong. And the result is that other ways of thinking about faces have been kind of ignored or not really very fully explored. So, and that's even as the meanings of the face are multiplying in our contemporary moment, in this era of pandemic and protest, of surveillance and surgery. So I'm trying to get to grips with all that and using a range of visual, textual, and digital sources. So the talk I'm going to give today is about the biometric face, and it's drawn from a longer chapter which puts Chinese tech into dialogue with Chinese art. And I look at 3 case studies, and each of them pairs a recent software application developed by Chinese researchers in the field of facial recognition technology with work by artists from contemporary China. And across these case studies, I'm looking at how these artworks mimic inside out, wrong way round, the operations of software which tries to identify and classify and decode the face. And these artworks, I think, can expose some of the problems in this web of power, precisely because they're so similar in many ways to the software programs themselves. And my aim isn't just to suggest that there's a similarity between machine learning about the face and portraits. I also want to argue that this pattern where you get facial recognition technology borrowing or stealing even from art undermines the core claims of this technology. Its core claims are about being cold, hard, and objective. Objectivity is the key thing. Okay, so in 2016, 2 Chinese AI researchers, Wu Xiaolin and Zhang Xi, published an article on Archive. Archive, as you probably know, is an open access repository for preprints, which is hosted by Cornell University. And it mostly covers the fields of science, maths, computer programming, and statistics. And it has a very high submission rate, 16,000 papers a month. The portal is quite appealing for researchers because it offers a pre-publication feedback mechanism. It provides open house for work which is probably going to find itself behind a paywall after it's been published, and partly because it allows researchers to stake a claim in a very high impact area of inquiry. And also for researchers based in China, I think its Anglophone medium is quite important because it offers borderless interaction with the global science community at a time when we're actually looking at increasingly shuttered access. Now, Wu Wenzhang's article was called It's always like when you give a talk about tech, the tech won't work. It was actually working about 7 minutes ago. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so here we go. This is the paper. It's called Automated Inference on Criminality Using Face Images, and it quickly became very notorious. It argues that facial recognition algorithms, and I'm quoting, can predict the likelihood that a person is a convicted criminal with nearly 90% accuracy using nothing but a driver's license style face photo. But the program was trained on very limited data. In order to conduct our experiments, the authors say, we collected 1,856 ID photos that satisfy the following criteria: Chinese, male, between ages of 18 and 55, no facial hair, no facial scars, unquote. So then they divided this database into two subsets, SN and SC for non-criminals and criminals, respectively. The non-criminal subset contained over 1,000 images scraped from the web using a spider tool, and its subjects came from a wide range of professions, including waiters, construction workers, taxi drivers, real estate agents, doctors, lawyers, professors. Roughly half of the individuals in this subset, the non-criminal subset, have university degrees. Meanwhile, subset SC, the other one, that comprised ID photos of 730 criminals, some of whom were on local or national most wanted lists, and others were provided by a city police department in China. So Wu and Zhang assert in this paper, and I'm quoting, that the criminal face images in SC, that's the criminal subset, are normal ID photos, not police mugshots, and that out of the 730 criminals, 235 committed violent crimes, including murder, rape, assault, kidnap, and robbery. The remaining are convicted of non-violent crimes like theft, fraud, abuse of trust, forgery, and racketeering. Okay, so this slide is actually the only sample of photographic IDs that the paper provides, and that already gives us some concerns about the paper. But the problems go deeper than this evidential base. More troubling is the core claim of the paper, which is the idea that you can read the mind from the face. And this claim is, of course, an open invocation of the pseudoscience of physiognomy. This is the very long discredited idea that there's a direct relationship between outer appearance and inner personality. But Wu and Zhang go further. They claim that they've identified, and I'm quoting, some discriminating structural features for criminality: lip curvature, eye corner distance, and the nose-mouth angle, unquote. So here they're going further than physiognomy. They're going into phrenology. Phrenology is the idea which was inaugurated by the 19th century criminologist Cesare Lombroso, that the shape of the head can predict certain mental, behavioral, or emotional behaviors. But perhaps most striking is their statement, and I'm quoting again, that unlike a human, a computer algorithm has no baggage. It has no emotions, no biases whatsoever due to past experience, race, religion, political doctrine, gender, age, no mental fatigue even. Okay, unquote. So this idea that machine learning is impartial is a bit worrying. Under any circumstances, actually, but it's very chilling in a program that is trying to predict criminality as if it were as innate as our eye color, when it's actually been trained on people who've fallen foul of the criminal justice system, a process in which guilt always lies in the eye of the beholder, really, the judicial beholder. So Wu and Zhang's paper is based on the idea that criminality is hardwired within the DNA of some people. It's a birth wrong, if you like, rather than a birthright. Rather than an act which actually takes place in a very complex and fluid societal relational system. So the paper assumes that everyone who's convicted is guilty and that everyone who hasn't been charged with a crime yet is innocent. So it's not interested in the burden of proof. Instead, the paper tries to identify the guilty on a predictive basis. alone. So you get probable noses, probable mouths, probable eyes. They're being pinpointed in an identity parade in which the shape of those facial features can be known in advance. Now, this paper became such a kind of infamous object, really, that it almost serves as a minor object lesson in how not to use machine learning methods. Kate Crawford cited it in her massive book, Atlas of AI, and the publicity took an even more sarcastic tone on Twitter, as it was called then, when users responded with some of these comments, which I hope you can see. Basically, a ghastly misuse of tech, phrenology in the deep learning era, Lombroso is back, and so on. Major newspapers published takedowns of the paper, and specialists, academic specialists, dissected it in academic journals. The negative heat generated by this paper became so intense that Wu and Zhang ended up publishing a rejoinder. This is their rejoinder. And the rejoinder says, I quote, "Our work is only intended for pure academic discussions. It's a total surprise to us that it's become a media consumption." And it accuses its critics of name calling. So I think Wu and Zhang are happy to admit that they shouldn't have taken court convictions as a sort of ground truth for machine learning, but they do stick to their claim, this claim, that, unquote, like most technologies, machine learning is neutral, unquote. So there was a lot of negative publicity about the paper then. But one aspect of it that didn't really get any attention was the insight that it offers into the close but usually quite hidden relationship between facial recognition technologies and art. The art critic Andrea Brighenti calls this space art valence. So that's a mixture of art and surveillance. It's a place where aesthetics and surveillance intersect. And to bring this up isn't just to make the point that technologies, despite all their claims to cold-blooded objectivity, are always created in the white heat of culture. They embody the hopes and dreams of the societies that produce them, as one critic put it. Rather, I'm interested here in the more specific relationship between facial recognition technologies and our ancient fixation with the human face as a painted thing. Facial recognitions form part of a really long genealogy of representational practices focused on the face. It stretches from the pyramids to the portrait, from the phenotype to the selfie. And these parallels, I think they matter because they show that many facial algorithms are actually interventions into law enforcement, which borrow quite outrageously from portraiture, old and new. Wu and Zhang's paper exemplifies this. It relies on the photographic portrait, and it's obsessed with the face as a composite construction, something made up. And I'm interested in what are the implications of this fact, the implications of the fact that this paper relies so heavily on visual media for its aims. What interest does that relationship serve? What does it tell us about art valence today in China and in other places? Some might say that these aren't very important questions. In fact, it's become quite fashionable to argue that art doesn't have anything to say about biometric surveillance and facial recognition technologies. And a key thinker on this theme is the artist and activist Trevor Paglen. He's argued that the emergence of these algorithms has thrust forms of art that used to be very successful into a state of redundancy, essentially. And he argues, and I'm quoting, "This is because the overwhelming majority of images are now made for machines by other machines, with humans rarely in the loop," unquote. And this comment goes right back to the ideas of the filmmaker Harun Foreki, who argues that images nowadays, and I'm quoting again, do not represent an object, but a part of an operation, unquote. So instead of needing meaning from us as interpreters, images are now forms of data that transmit information. And so they don't really require human creators or human spectators. And the problem, also critics like Trevor Paglen argue, is that artists and art critics haven't faced up to this change. They still think that humans are looking at images. And as Paglen puts it, that the relationship between human viewers and images is the most important moment to analyze. And even when art does try and step up its intervention, it often sabotages itself. The example we could use is those works which use disguise, so masks, face paint, camouflage, and so on, to try and escape CCTV cameras. But in the process, all they really do is produce images which can then be incorporated into data sets to make them better at recognizing people who've got masks on. So I think this is a takedown of art, which is maybe not very surprising, given that we live in very techno-dystopian times. But I think I don't think it's very helpful. It's quite morbid, and it's also obsessed with the West. The hard fact is that art has always struggled to change the world. And its methods have really only very, very infrequently managed to land hard punches on the tough exterior of political systems. So I think there's a bit of a straw man going on here. And it's the idea that if art were a bit different, it could take on the juggernaut of big data and it could win. And maybe there's an implicit recognition that actually this isn't true, in the fact that people like Paglen actually encourage forms of criminality as art's new frontier in the era of algorithmic governance. Of course, this kind of criminal art, if you like, would be pretty kamikaze in authoritarian China. But this point hasn't really made much dent on the shape of current commentary. And this is because research on biometric art hasn't really paid any attention to China at all so far, despite everyone's quite broad awareness that the Chinese state is a global leader in the development and the deployment of this kind of software. And despite the fact that Chinese artists have also produced a lot of work about this theme, which needs our attention. I think we need to reconsider the idea that rogue activism, criminal activism, is the only way for art to confront the power of facial recognition technologies. But underlying this is another point. And I think here, arguments about how useless art is, how helpless art is, they rest on a kind of binary division, on a tidy divide between technology and aesthetics. They assume that those two things are very separate. When in fact, I think their relationship is rather different. It's about energized encounter rather than about a hard split. And I think we need to probe more closely the nature of this force field between art and technology. Okay, and so to think about this relationship, I want to look now at the work of two Chinese artists who have been really big names in the Chinese art world for a long time, but whose works have begun to acquire new meanings in the biometric epoch. And the first one is Yue Minjun, and the second is Feng Lijun. And here are some examples of, first of all, Feng's work. They were born in 1962 and 1963, respectively, and they're the kind of leading apostles of the so-called cynical realism movement, which emerged in Beijing after the crackdown of 1989. And both artists are portraitists. They paint the face. And they both paint the same protagonist again and again. This protagonist, these are just a very, very, very limited few examples, really. In the case of Feng, this subject is a shady figure with a shaven head. In the case of Yue, it's a grinning joker who seems to have a lockjaw. Now, many commentators have placed these artists in the shadow of June 4th, and they've argued that they embody the sense of existential despair of the Chinese people in the aftermath of the crackdown, and that the tedious sameness of these faces speaks to the struggle for individuality during the 1990s. And I think these are good interpretations for the 1990s, but they don't tell us very much about this practice of painting, which both artists have continued to work on in the years since. Feng, in particular, is still very much at work in the present moment. Now, you could say that these motifs of portraiture continue because the painters are one-trick ponies. They're artistic performers who get ridiculously overpaid for doing the same thing again and again. One of Feng's bald heads sold at Sotheby's in Hong Kong for over $7.5 million in 2014. But I think it might be truer to say that the two artists have been drawn back again and again into this idea of the serial portrait, the identical portrait, because this kind of image making has something to say about China now, which is no doubt why Feng titled his 2019 solo exhibition in Australia, Facial Recognition. These portraits take on new meaning when we think about them in the context of the contemporary Chinese facescape and its regime of biometric surveillance. This is because these portraits, they mock the phenotype. They mock its claims to insight into human behavior. So you've got Feng's repetitive avatar, whose bald head evokes associations of the criminal or the prisoner, and you've got Yue's caricatures, who smile and smile at nothing at all. Both of them satirize the idea that our facial features can tell us anything about our personalities. As these avatars and these caricatures repeat on painting after painting, they turn art into a space where algorithms about surveillance can be kind of thwarted. After all, one of the main objectives of algorithms is to criminalize. And so they lose their power in a visual world where every human figure looks identically deviant. Catch me if you can, the portraits seem to say. You'll have to find me first. Now, quite a few scholars have noticed the connection between the seriality of these portraits and the first Qin emperor's terracotta army in Xi'an. Yuan Minjun actually makes a thing out of these similarities in his sculptural series, which you can see here, which is called Contemporary Terracotta Warriors, or Shendabi Mayong. The links between these figures pivot on the modular nature of both this sculpture series and the original warriors. As I'm sure you know, the terracotta sculptures were constructed from prefabricated body parts, the head, the torso, the legs, and so on. And although molds were also used for faces, specific features were added by hand using clay and pigment in order to impart individuality. And this method of manufacturing permitted multiple permutations from a limited set of parts. So it created the illusion that every warrior was his own man, and indeed represented an actual soldier, when in fact every statue kept a very strong structural resemblance to all the rest of the group because it had been molded from exactly the same set of parts. But there's a very big difference between the terracotta method and Feng and Yue's portraiture practice, and it relates to the face. The first emperor's soldiers were mainly modularized, as I say, from the neck down. Their facial features were delineated then with a personal touch. And even as they were reduplicated in such huge numbers that they filled the emperor's vast necropolis, they still managed to retain a kind of subjectivity. But in the work of Fang Lijun and Yue Minjun, it's everything apart from the face which changes. It's the environment in which the figures are placed, it's the poses that their bodies strike, it's the actions they perform. Meanwhile, the face stays the same, particularly, of course, in the case of Yue. So despite their status of portraits, these are paintings which reject the idea that the human face is expressive. Both the bald heads and the toothy jokers are uniform facially. The face has become a mold. It's been modularized into a sloping forehead and too many teeth. And this, of course, is the world of Cesare Lombroso. It's the world of phrenology. Tellingly, Lombroso was very talkative on the topic of teeth. He wrote that they are especially important because criminals rarely have normal teeth. And in a passage which here, which prefigures the work of Yue Minjun, he writes, very often the teeth of the criminal show a strange uniformity, which recalls the homodontism of the lower vertebrates. But if anything, Lombroso was even more obsessed with the criminal's skull, the shape of the criminal head. He writes, as the seat of all the greatest disturbances, this part manifests the greatest number of anomalies. Now, it's quite hard to think of a head shape which isn't included in Lombroso's diagnosis here. And Fang Lijun, he features skull shapes of almost every type that Lombroso mentions, round ones, small ones, large ones, malformed ones, all of them completely bald, so they can show off their perversity even better. So quite apart from the echoes of Lombroso, the shaven head, as you know, also has connections to criminality in China. There was an ancient form of punishment known as kunqian, which decreed that prisoners had to have their heads shaved and be forced to wear an iron collar around their necks. But regardless of whether Fang and Yue are familiar with Lombroso, which I guess they're probably not, their paintings have been exploring for a long time now the idea that the human face and any of its features can actually tell us something about deviance and criminality. But precisely because of the tediousness, the repetitiveness of their portraits, these aspects, so that the head shapes, the abnormal teeth, they lose any meaning really, because instead of endorsing phrenology, instead of endorsing the illusion that criminality has a certain look, their canvases repeat one particular facial trait so endlessly that the science, the so-called science of identification, becomes ridiculous. How can a sloping forehead or too many teeth predict criminality when every single figure and every single portrait has exactly the same feature? And I think it's in this sense that the portraits of Fang and Yue satirize the resurgence of phrenology and physiognomy in the AI age. They mimic the basic method of machine learning, and they show us how absurd it is. Now, this point is quite well illustrated if we put Lombroso's grid together with these two paintings by Yue Minjun. Lombroso's grid looks like a kind of early prototype for Wu Wenzhang's paper. It's accompanied by notes, as you can see, which tell us about the thief from Naples or the forger from Piedmont. Here the criminal is being identified via fragmented facial features. So a prominent lower jaw tells us we've got a thief, a hooked nose tells us we have a forger. And these are replicated multiple times in each of the illustrations in Criminal Man, Lombroso's important book. And this relationship between deviant facial features and a specific criminal profile comes about via portraits, artistic sketches of individuals within, as you can see, a grid framework. And the two grids by Yue Minjun, by contrast, they laugh at notions of phrenology. At first sight, this gaping mouth, which repeats itself, looks like a sign of perversity, of criminality. But as the grin goes on and on and on, as it repeats itself, it loses that delinquent meaning because the figure is always grinning, whatever the scene, whatever the season. And in this way, Yue's Joker disrupts the line of thought, which we can see from Lombroso all the way to Wu and Zhang, that, as Shakespeare put it, there's an art to find the mind's construction in the face. And I think Shakespeare's words are quite helpful here because they remind us that myths about physiognomy long predate Lombroso. They have a long genealogy in China too, and in the practice of Chinese portraiture. The historian Wang Xing has noted that the practice of physiognomy was frequently recorded in official historiography from the early days of Chinese history. It's documented in texts as venerable as Sima Qian's Shiji and the records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shou. And although marking the face and the body was associated with fortune telling, it also gave divinatory properties which linked up to the grander cosmos. And the first text to engage very deeply with physiognomy in painting was, by no coincidence, also the first treatise which dealt with the art of the portrait too. It was written by the Yuan scholar Wang Yi, who states that, I'm quoting, "Whoever paints a portrait must be thoroughly familiar with the rules of physiognomy," unquote. And these rules dictated that the face should be divided into 5 mountains, Wuyue, Wuyue, and 4 rivers, Sedu, as in this slide. And this is a diagrammatic pattern which, quite like Lombroso's, works on the principle of combining different facial parts into a complete and knowable whole. So in this sense, the rejection of physiognomy as an insight into the soul, an insight into the future as well, that we see with Fang and Yue is a riposte which links up the past with the algorithmic present. So I'm going to move on a bit here and talk about why this matters. And my main aim, I think, in drawing Wu and Zhang's paper together alongside these portraits by Fang and Yue has been to think about some of the ways in which technology and aesthetics are interacting in an era in which the face is now mobilized as a multi-bladed instrument of power. Quite often now we hear about how we now need philosophy in this age of AI. So I've been reading recently about how top tech firms say they want in-house philosophers to deal with spiraling ethical dilemmas. They need a moral operating system then to complement the tech operating system. But if facial recognition technologies now stand at the forefront of machine learning and its power, it might be truer to say that we also need to be thinking about big data, not just philosophically, but aesthetically too, in terms of art. And this is because facial recognition technologies have hugely amplified and diversified the role of portraits, images of the human face. They've lifted the face from its already key role in the domain of interpersonal interaction into a tool of power, into a tool of process, which is being used across an extraordinary range of settings. As the face is evolving into a core societal operating system of its own, life as we live it is being increasingly organized around the facial template, from law enforcement to border checks, social media and apps, retail, banking, healthcare. The creation of this new facescape has required the collecting, the processing, the storing, the mobilizing of portraits, human images of the face, far too numerous to count. It's a data ocean of faces whose level is rising steadily by the second. But just because these images are being used for informational purposes doesn't mean that they've lost all their representational meaning. On the contrary, the range and the reach of their use nowadays, I think, can be looked at the other way around. It's a historically unprecedented infiltration of artistic objects into the way that states rule and the life worlds of the people that they govern. Or to put this another way, just because images of faces now function as action verbs, so they unlock things, they purchase things, they alert us to things, that doesn't mean that they've lost their object status, their role as aesthetic things which are created via processes which are artistic and which use medial forms which belong originally to the world of representation. And I don't think that the implications of this shift are being addressed enough yet. And one way of thinking about these implications is to look at an offshoot of the regime of the datafied face, and that's the world of the deep fake. There are quite a few discussions underway now about this kind of synthetic media, and they focus on the threat it poses to law and order and on the regulatory efforts which are underway to control it. And of course, this is a predictable focus, given that deepfakes can really wreak hell on people via fake news, revenge porn, financial fraud, privacy violation, and so on. And a particular anxiety at the moment is the capacity of deepfakes to trick facial recognition systems, and in this way weaken our trust in the biometric project more generally. But at the end of the day, the deepfake is actually quite similar to the aesthetic impulse, which also drives those same state-sanctioned technologies. Automated inference, in other words, and the deepfake are not so far apart from each other. They both use machine learning to fabricate faces and to tell tales about them. So I think it's quite hypocritical for governments to be worrying about deepfakes when they're so committed themselves to quite similar forms of AI. More to the point, the deepfake throws into relief the potential for destructive deceit, which is harbored by facial recognition technologies. The deepfake shows that the creative character of this technology, its proximity to art, in other words, it can be harnessed for very dangerous purposes, for purposes of dissimulation, disinformation, disenfranchisement. The central rationale of facial recognition technologies is their claim to read a stable identity directly off the body, as one critics put it. But when we consider this branch of big data alongside the deep fakes with which it shares so many characteristics, that claim starts to look quite disingenuous. As these technologies proliferate, they are actively destabilizing identity by detaching the face from its owner, even though they tell us that they're about the process of nailing down that identity with ever more forensic accuracy. And they often use the forms and the practices of art as their accomplices in that process. So facial recognition technologies can be seen as a kind of identity theft, and one that's being perpetrated through the aesthetic. Images of faces have increasing uses, increasing volume, but the link that ties these images to real faces is growing ever weaker. The face as a tool is getting stronger as its relation to actual human subjects is getting weaker. And this is a system which clearly serves its masters. Our faces, which have long been so determinant of who we are as people, are now being turned into entities through which power tells us what it wants us to be. So the aim of what I've been saying today has been to explore some of the implications of the fact that AI about the face is often marked by artistic creativity, even as these applications pretend to be completely dispassionate and objective informational tools. And as the deluge of deepfakes that we see around us shows very clearly, algorithms of this kind are perfect for a post-truth world, we were saying. The problem, of course, is that deepfakes are merely the most jagged, the most visible edge of that technological thrust, which is moving in less obvious ways right across the landscape. So, to put that another way, deepfakes boast about how they're the perfect tech for post-truth times, whereas facial recognition technologies pretend to be about pure fact, even as they're being used for post-truth purposes. By delinking faces from the people to whom they belong, while pretending to do the exact opposite, facial recognition technologies are breaking the human face up into its component parts in order to reassemble them into molds which fit particular political narratives and tell particular stories about society. And this process uses the key principle of the portrait, which is its status as a likeness of the face, not the face itself, to legitimize a new regime of power which isn't just casting off its responsibilities to truth, it's also masking that move under the guise of scientific rationality. But there's a final point that I want to finish on. And I think it's important to remember that the relationship between art and facial technologies in China doesn't exist in some kind of vacuum, despite what certain foreign media might say. This media attention often sort of varies between terrifying accounts of hardcore algorithmic control in China and amusement, laughter about the daily applications of this text, as you can see in the infamous story about how facial recognition technologies are used to stop people stealing toilet roll in public lavatories. In each of these cases, for opposite reasons, China is being depicted as some kind of crazy outlier, a space apart from the rest of the world. But the truth is that algorithms about the face are unethical wherever they are, in whatever nation state these technologies are used. And perhaps more to the point, commentators need to be a lot more reflective about their motives for criticizing China. Criticizing the use of this tech, the abuse of this tech in Chinese society can serve a kind of deflecting purpose, as citizens of nation states whose own rulers are also using this software look very closely at other places while turning their gaze away from what's happening in their home nations. And particularly now, as democracy is in free fall, it can be very tempting to offset a sense of personal powerlessness by thinking a lot about the behavior of more openly authoritarian states, as if the challenge to rights and the challenge to identity there could make things in other places seem less under threat. And this kind of thinking leads to a false sense of segregation in which China gets, as I said, set apart from peer states, when in fact there are far, far more similarities than differences among the major countries which have been deploying facial recognition technologies. So I guess with this in mind, my aim here is also to suggest that if facial recognition technologies are a reality everywhere, then so are the meanings and the value of art in China. They too stretch beyond the immediate Chinese context. So if art can say something about the biometric face in China, then I think it has something to say about the biometric face everywhere. And I will leave it there. Thank you for your attention.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Margaret, for the talk. Got me thinking, how aesthetic or art principles, can help us to understand better this age of biometric surveillance. Indeed, it got me thinking, principles of formalism, for example, how it relates to, the face in the age of biometric surveillance. Okay, we have until 6, so we have ample time for Q&A, whether both in person or online. Maybe we'll get a couple of questions from the floor over here in the auditorium first. Anyone wants to ask a question, thoughts, comments? Okay, Cheng-Ming.
Hi.
Maybe we'll pass you a mic so that the people online can hear you as well. Yeah.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks for the
Hi.
talk. Really enjoyed it. So I just wanted to, I haven't read the papers, the two papers you mentioned by the two Chinese scientists, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. So I wonder if part of the kind of pretension to neutrality could be defended, as it were, and or deflected, as it were. So they might say, oh, neutrality really rests not with at the level of the input or not at the level of the output, but at the level of the processes that we're kind of thinking about, that we're relying on. And once we fix the input, and which we can fix the input, so the promise goes, then we get some true neutral output without bias, right? Without the biases that attach to the interpretation of faces, the interpretation of expressions and the like. So I was wondering if you could tell us more, first of all, about the papers, and then importantly, what you think about them.
Well, thank you for that very interesting question. I think I would have to, I suppose, fundamentally disagree about the issue of neutrality, because I think it would definitely be possible through more trial and error, through a more expansive data set, to produce an outcome, an algorithm that was more quote unquote objective. But I think that kind of covers up a more fundamental problem, which is if in the pursuit of ever more objective and ever more perfected objectivity, we may lose sight of the more troublesome question, which is, do we want this? And I think there's the fixation with finessing and perfecting algorithms is perhaps misleading and subversive and disquieting, precisely because it leads us further and further down that path and further away from a questioning stance, which would say, well, why are we subjecting our lived reality to these applications in the first place? So I agree with you about, on one side of the argument, about neutrality, but I would question whether that is a goal that we want to look for. And in terms of the papers, I've looked at papers that were posted on Archive, which, as I say, is a very major portal, and I focused on papers that have been posted between 2016 and 2021, and I looked at papers that had been submitted to the portal using some sort of criteria, some set criteria. So the researchers had to be based in mainland Chinese institutions, and they had to use visual media in their papers, not just graphs. They had to be really engaging with images that had, as I say, a genealogical relationship with art historical images. And I found that every year there were more of them. They went up from, I can't remember the numbers, I've got them somewhere on my computer, but they essentially tripled in that short period of time. So I think this is a field that's in a real hurry. It's moving at top speed. And it is, I guess, perfecting itself. But is that what we want? So thank you. That's it's a great question.
Thank you. Any other questions, thoughts?
Hi, thanks so much for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you about the concept of the portrait.
Yeah.
What do you mean by this, and what do we get from thinking about images like computer-generated ones, but also artworks like Yue's and Fang's as portraits? I think some conventional Western definitions of portraiture would require a depiction of a specific known individual, which arguably neither Fang's nor Yue's works conform to. But it's a term that nevertheless has other uses, perhaps. I wonder if you could talk more about what that's doing for you.
Sure, that's another extremely good question. Portraiture, as you know, is a very contested term. I mean, you've alluded to that fact in your question. And I've read now many accounts of what constitutes a portrait, and they don't have much in common with each other. So, although I would entirely agree with you that to call Fang and Yue's portraiture practice portraiture is not something that everyone will agree with. And I would also accept that there are going to be people who dispute the portraiture credentials of computer-generated images, or even images of the kind that Wu and Zhang are using. But what we actually are seeing in portraiture practice across the globe right now is a very decisive move away from any set conventional definition of what a portrait is and does. So to the extent that Ernst van Alphen, I think it was, coined the term the anti-portrait. And this is something that's been going on since Picasso in the early 20th century, actually. But challenges to portraiture are how a portraiture stays alive. I think that's one point worth conceding. But more generally, artists in the contemporary moment are producing portraits that have completely forsaken the idea of resemblance. They've got no interest in producing a likeness. And they've even forsaken the idea that portraits should be about the face. So we're seeing a new mode of portraiture, which calls itself portraiture, in which you get digital code being a portrait, or bits of jelly being a portrait, or a sunset being a portrait. Any painted canvas or any representational object which is trying to capture the essence of the sitter, I think could qualify as a portrait. So although I accept the idea that the term as I'm using it might not agree with everyone, might not meet everyone's expectations, I actually think that the kinds of works I've been talking about are much closer to portraiture as it's being conventionally construed than many artworks today which are calling themselves portraits.
Hi, I'm a historian of science and technology, and I really like your talk. I actually studied history of physiognomy and phrenology a little bit, and the heart of the two fields, which now call pseudoscience, is that there is some generalizable truth from this kind of the facial features and that kind of the skull features, we can just draw out what this guy is going to do in the future. And this is repeatedly proven again and again. They claim that this is somehow the scientific knowledge that we can trust. What is so striking in your talk is that the two Chinese scientists, is somehow working on the same principle. Through the use of the AI, we can just detect facial features which tend to exhibit the future criminality or current criminality. And then this is actually a generalizable truth. But when we perceive other people's faces, we really don't think in that way. A guy can look handsome to this group of people, but may not look handsome, may look ordinary to other group of people. An actress is very popular and they look pretty to certain group of fans, but don't look so and may look ugly to other kind of the people. So it is actually a very much subjective. So how? So it means that the how is the idea of our own perception of the subjectivity in face recognition is to be translated as objectivity. Objectivity means that no matter what person perceives, the result is the same. I do a certain kind of experiment here in Singapore, in UK, US, the same result is obtained, and then we can actually call it objectivity. But face recognition is actually totally different. It is completely subjective. And the AI technology is somehow transforming that completely. And the connection between the Chinese portraiture and the face reading somehow is to be understood some primordial form of the objectivity of the human faces. That is actually my question.
I think what you're saying there is really spot on. It's completely how I feel about this. That there's so much wrong with the very premise of these technologies that it seems utterly baffling to me that we're in them knee deep already. You're absolutely right that the idea that there is a hardwired criminality is not something that's going to be picked up by subjective people in subjective encounters with other subjective others. It's just not. It's not a functioning reality. It's miles away from a ground truth, and yet there is so little pushback against that core notion that faces can be read, and I find that really intriguing. Why is there not more pushback? And you actually see exactly the same thing with emotion recognition technology, which I look at in another part of the paper. And emotion recognition technology is based on the idea of basic emotions. I can't remember the name of the guy who came up with this. I'm having a bit of a forgetful moment. Anyway, the basic emotion thesis is that there are 7 emotions that humans can universally recognize, that to use your term, that are generalizable from every emotional encounter. But in actual reality, that's not how the human face works at all. And there are many times when there's a critical ambiguity, or when there are multiple emotions in play at the same time, or when a face remains peculiarly passive despite emotions surging below the surface. So if anything, the idea of emotion recognition technology is even more flawed than facial recognition technology. And yet, as I said, these algorithms that are being, and I was only looking at a small cross section of the papers of this kind that are being posted on Archive. There are, of course, countless others being produced by other computer scientists all around the world and not using visual media particularly. So it's a field which is expanding at an exponential rate, and at the same time as being rooted in exceptionally flawed premises. So it's a mystery, and we need to instead of, as I said, instead of demonizing China or whoever, we need to be thinking about what this is going to do to our lives and ourselves.
I have a question from QI.
Exercise, right? Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm really happy to see that you've mentioned Yue Minjun and Fang Yijun in such a different way, framing it under this discussion of the biometric phase and biometric art, etc. But it kind of makes me also think about another two artists, Chinese artists. One is Xu Bing, particularly his video work, Dragonfly Eyes, which he also talks a lot about how these kind of surveillance and facial recognition in a rather different way, because he also mentions a lot on plastic surgery and also how gender becomes really fluid, because a male could have changed both their face and also their gender in such a way that even the cameras cannot tell the difference between all these people with the same faces. But then what another artist which I really am more interested to talk about is perhaps Lu Yang, which I'm quite curious to know whether you have also studied it in your project, particularly because she, I would say she comes from a rather different generation of artists compared with Xu Bing or Yue Minjun's generation. And it appears to me that these post-80s or even the younger generations are more celebratory of this kind of AI technology. And also Lu Yang particularly, she basically use a lot of these facial recognition and motion capture and collaborate with a lot of other performers in different parts of the world and try to gather all their bio data and also using her own bio data to create this artwork which she creates this avatar blending everybody's movements and expressions, facial expressions into a kind of perfected person who can dance in a wonderful way and also looks, although resembling her own faces, but then she can do basically whatever she wants, as she mentioned. So I think to me, it seems that some of these artists are really embracing these kind of changes and also these kind of technologies. And I'm curious to know whether you also see how the artists are, different artists are also approaching or these technologies differently.
That's another fantastic question. Thank you. Well, first of all, yes, Xu Bing is a very important reference point here. And I do actually have a case study about him in the longer chapter from which this talk I just gave comes. And I talk about him, as I was just saying, in terms of emotional recognition technology. I think his film is a kind of predictive spoof about the emergence of emotion recognition technology, because what he does essentially is create a situation of emotion in the wild, which is very hard to do. So far, emotion recognition technology apps have been based on very highly structured, highly rigid, highly limited scenarios where people are for example, in performing in a play or on a TV show and using that as the source for the expressions on their faces. Whereas Xu Bing, via his extraordinary experiment with 80,000 hours of footage, actually manages to capture what people's faces are like in the wild. And what he discovers, what he shows us, is that they tell us absolutely nothing about what's going on in people's minds whatsoever. As you know, the film is, in addition to being fluid about gender and a brilliant exposition of plastic surgery, it's also unbelievably violent. And that was after he'd performed a very stringent edit on the footage. He said most of the footage was so gruesome was so grotesque that he couldn't have used it. So what we see is a very, very toned down version. But even then, I mean, I've screenshotted in a rather unpleasant task the various episodes of violence, and I've just have a file full of absolutely appalling images. But in no single one of them is there any emotion registered on any face. So that's one thing. Lu Yang is a really interesting case, and I think you're right that she's leaning in to AI and leaning into its possibilities. I haven't investigated her work, and you've inspired me to go. I considered doing so, and the reason I didn't was because I think I see her work differently from you in the sense that it seems to me to be about the body. It seemed to me to be about embodied practices far more than about faces, and that may be my misreading. And I think I need to go back to her work and see, in the light of what you said, whether I've misunderstood it, whether I've missed some things. But the reason why I didn't pursue her further was because I found the intensely embodied nature of her work to be part of what I was saying at the beginning of my talk, the ideas of body being paramount. And I wanted to move towards face. But I think what you're saying about a different generation of artists is something that I need to investigate further, and I thank you for that. Another artist we might think about is Zhang Xiaogang, who again is somebody replicating the same faces or more or less identical faces on canvas after canvas. And maybe and he too has continued with that practice well beyond, the 90s. And although his work is always associated with, family portraiture from the Cultural Revolution period, I think now we can read it differently. I think that's another interesting point, actually, that even if an artist comes into their practice, comes into their sense of being as a creator at a certain moment, their work does change its meanings as contexts shift, and it seems to me that that can be said of all three of Zhang Xiaogang as well as the two artists I was talking about today. That they begin as painters who are talking about Chinese history, and they become painters, I think, whose work is meaningful or can be interpreted through the prism of very contemporary concerns. But thank you for bringing that point to my attention. I'll go back and look at her work again.
Do you have any more questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you, Professor Helen Brown. It's such a fascinating talk. I actually have a small question because you just briefly mentioned at the beginning that you also want to talk more about the face mask. I'm more curious about that part. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
I can't really do that yet because I haven't written that chapter. But in terms of basic principles, I'm really interested in how the mask operates within protest settings and how it operates within pandemic settings, and how in the case of Hong Kong in 2019 and 2019, it was operating right at the intersection of protest and pandemic simultaneously. But I haven't got to that chapter yet. I think it will be a very challenging one to write for quite a few reasons, but masks are crucial to facescapes. And I think I would also, if possible, like to write a chapter about defacement, about practices in which the face is obliterated, which is again quite a different practice from masking. But I'm not sure about whether I will find the kind of primary materials that would make that meaningful. At the moment, it's just an idea. But I'm sorry I can't answer your question yet. I haven't got to that bit, but thank you for asking.
Anyone online, actually? No. Okay. Maybe I'll ask a question if I may.
You may.
So from my understanding of the lecture just now, we talked a lot about how data is being used, or like biometric data of the face is being used for generalization purposes and how artists react and respond to it, right? But I'm thinking also the flip side of it, which is biometric data of the face being used for identification and for differentiation. Right. I'm thinking especially in the recent case of Singapore, where we don't even have to scan our passports nor our fingerprints anymore. We just use the face to cross borders, to cross our customs, right? You may have experienced it. Yeah, recently. So I'm thinking, how does this tie in with, your entire project? The face as a form of identification and as a form of differentiation.
Well, I think that goes back to what I was trying to say in the conclusion, that practices like facial recognition in airports or facial recognition to open our telephones, they are very seductive. The reason why we've accepted them is because they hugely convenience our lives. And I think what we're talking about here is a trade-off, obviously, between convenience and autonomy, between ease and freedom. But I'm not sure that there is a difference between faces being used to differentiate and faces being used to generalize. But I think what actually happens is that there's a slippage between the 2 points. And that the idea is that, or the mythology of the technologies is that they will allow us to differentiate. But in practice, what they're doing is via phrenology, via physiognomy, they're introducing generalizing principles, generalizing tropes that then can be made coercive and destructive. I think that's actually the crux of the problem.
I have a question over there. We can take maybe, including this one, 2 questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Prof, for the very fascinating sharing. And I was just thinking about, because you were sharing about the idea of defacement and the project you're going to write about facial recognition. Because the one technology that I was thinking about that developed over the pandemic was the idea of those face IDs that you can access even through a mask.
Yeah.
Whereby even with half of it gone, half of what is supposed to be a core identity of who you are is gone, you can still be recognized.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how this technology and further, and in your view, more pernicious developments of it, face into retina scanning, for instance, that kind of technology that can kind of subvert the face almost.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've read about this. As I say, I haven't got to this chapter yet, but I'm really intrigued by that anomaly, because it in a way, it thwarts the entire underlying logic of the mask. I mean, if we're using masks, I mean, we all feel when we wear masks that we inhabit a slightly, well, I feel when I wear a mask, a slightly freer space, and we can pass through the world in a slightly more anonymous way. But what you're saying, what that technology is proving, is that there isn't an escape from biometric surveillance. And what I found working on this project is that the different facescapes I've been talking about, initially I imagined that they would be different from each other, they would be distinctive in a sense. But what actually is far more true is that they're very tightly interlocked. And what you've just said just proves that again, that the masked face, which should be a retreat from the biometric facescape, is actually becoming subsumed within it. And I found very similar things when I was working on the chapter about cosmetic surgery, and in particular looking at Wang Hong and the surgeries to create that kind of facial template. Because on the one hand, they seem to be moving very, very directly against the logic of the biometric face. Because if women in particular are having a full suite of sometimes very invasive plastic surgery to look like a particular kind of celebrity live streamer, then how can they be identified? So it seems as if that's in opposition to the biometric face. But actually what I found as I got deeper into the subject was that just as the biometric face controls, and it controls mainly men, I think, in terms of criminality, the surgically altered face is also a means of control, targeting more commonly women. So that the two facescapes, although they appear to be one about criminality, mostly focused on men, and about how no face can escape attention because its features are genetically encoded and cannot be changed. The other facescape seems to be saying the exact opposite, being targeted more at women and relying on the principle that DNA can be distorted. It doesn't matter how your face was born. You can defy it. But ultimately, both the facescapes are about denying agency. So I think again, it's what you're saying reminds me of that there isn't as it were a trio or a quartet or whatever of different facescapes. They're all part of an emerging facial universe. Thank you for bringing that up.
Right, we can take one last question. If anyone has questions, thoughts, comments. See mine and then I'll take yours.
Hi, me again. Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering if
Yeah.
you could say a little bit more about your very brief reference to Levinas at the start. So, he talks about, seeing the face
Yeah.
of the divine in the face of the other, the face of the other is an enigma. But I was wondering if you could do a little bit, I guess for me and for us, to kind of juxtapose it with another strand of philosophical responses to skepticism about the other mind. So here I'm thinking about people like Wittgenstein, who say that we see, for example, the pain that the other from the face of the other. It's not that we know cognitively by some inference or the like, but that we see through the face something that is inside. And I was wondering whether this juxtaposition could do a little bit of work for us in understanding what exactly has gone wrong with, say, phrenology or physiognomy. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Levinas has to be a crucial reference point for anyone working on the face. And I find his work personally very compelling. But the idea of how we come into the deepest sense of ourselves through our encounter with the other, which is the premise of his work on the face, I simply don't find it meaningful for the facescapes that I'm investigating, and that may be my personal theoretical predilection. It may be a distortion of reality, but I find that Deleuze and Guattari actually, rather than Wittgenstein, are a more compelling counterpoint to Levinas, and I know that their work on the machine of faciality, as they call it, has in some senses been seen as an exaggerated, an over rhetoricized critique of Levinas, and I think it certainly was produced in response to the ethical idealism, perhaps, of Levinas. But I think what we're seeing, in a sense, is what Deleuze and Guattari set out: the idea that faces roll off machines, and that they rob us of our identity in the process. But what they could never have foretold, I suppose, is the advent of AI, which has accelerated that process to such a phenomenal and phenomenally terrifying degree. But I'm struck by your reference to Wittgenstein. I think I need to go back to him because I've only really been thinking about him in terms of family resemblance, and I think that's what you're saying there is another good reminder. So thank you to the various people who've given me thoughts, whether it's about facial recognition that can be achieved through masks, or Lu Yang or Wittgenstein. I'm very grateful for your input and for all the questions, actually.
Thank you. And with that, can we all thank Margaret for the wonderful talk and for her presence here in Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hope you have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Hello.